Paul, before I get started, I want to do some introductions for you, but what drives you? What is it that motivates you to continue doing what you're doing, speaking around the world, publishing? You've got some great material out there. It's got a moral monster, which is really making a difference. Coming to terms with the justice of God, the gospel, and the marketplace of ideas. One of my favorites is true for you, not true for me. Mm-hmm. Tell me what it is about you that drives you and to continue doing what you're doing.
Well, of course, fundamentally it's belonging to God and having been transformed by the gospel, and also connected to that has been my own journey and having found apologetics, having found that the faith that my parents had and lived out so wonderfully was a faith that I could own, not just because it made me feel good, not because it gave me comfort and security, although it certainly does, but because it is true. And during my high school years and beyond, I came to see that the Christian faith actually had solid objective reasons in support of it, that it was not simply a faith that I could just kind of adopt from my parents without thinking about it, but it was something that I could own for myself because it was true. And so this was something that has been important to me and has been helpful in my own pilgrimage, helping to deal with doubts, helping to deal with objections to the Christian faith, mm-hmm. helping to put things together for me in a way that makes excellent sense. And I see that the Christian faith, so like C.S. Lewis said, he says, I believe in Christianity like I believe the sun exists. He says, I believe not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. Mm. And that illumination, the clarity that the Christian faith brings, it addresses and answers issues that would, as one philosopher said, would otherwise be intractable in other worldviews. So I just find that the light that the Christian faith brings to me, and as I've talked to people, the light that it brings to others is something that I myself want to pass on to others. It's as though the ways in which I've been helped, the ways in which my faith has been strengthened, I want to impart to others, given the training and interest and even personality type that I have. These are what are behind why I'm engaging in what I do.
Universalism, John Hick and others will tell you that there are many lights, one lamp, or something to that effect. There's always different metaphors. This light within you, to light you to the transcendent, the true, the good, and the beautiful. Many claim there are many paths to this. People who are really dedicated to seeing that. And many people believe different values of truth. I mean, on a philosophical perspective, don't we even have to begin to even define these things before we can defend them? How do you wrap your mind around saying, why Christ among a world of others?
Yeah. Well, it is Christ who came into the world, who brings light to all, as John 1 says. And as I look at the various, again, John Hick was a universalist, a pluralist, that there are different pathways, that there are many different religions that are ways in which we can find salvation or liberation, that it's not simply the Christian faith or Jesus Christ in particular. And I would simply say, as you look at the kinds of things that the Christian faith presents, for example, Jesus Christ, who claims to be the unique revelation of God, unlike Muhammad or Buddha or Confucius, and how in a very conservative Jewish setting you have Jesus followers who are worshiping him. And then not simply Jesus claiming this, not simply Jesus followers believing it, but Jesus bodily rises from the dead to vindicate those claims. And we can add that the Christian faith presents a unique path of salvation, in that the Christian faith is one that emphasizes grace as opposed to human achievement, that salvation somehow rests on our shoulders, that it is distinctive in this way as well. And we could add, and I know you're familiar with this, that the Christian faith is also checkable. It is unique in the fact that the Christian faith opens itself up to scrutiny, that it opens itself up to investigation. As the Apostle Paul said when he was on trial, these things that were not done in a corner. The Christian faith is open to scrutiny. And again, I could go down the list, but again, when the pluralist like John Hick is going to say, well, the Christian faith is just one of many pathways.
Right.
The problem is it's not being fair to the Christian faith itself, but it also requires that the Christian faith has to be watered down or distorted. It doesn't allow the Christian faith to be presented as is. Jesus cannot be the revelation of God, the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity. Jesus has to be a mere human who is highly God conscious, but cannot be divine. He cannot be the one whom God raised from the dead. So they have to water down the evidence for the divinity of Jesus, that this developed over time, John Hick would say, or the bodily resurrection of Jesus has to play down or water down the evidence for that. And so it doesn't actually allow the Christian faith to be the Christian faith. It has to be some sort of a liberal view of Jesus, as opposed to allowing the Christian faith to be what it is. And so, again, we can talk about a number of things, but I think one motivation behind the pluralist impulse is that, well, what about those others who grow up in traditions that haven't heard of the good news of Jesus and so forth? Are they somehow cut off from that? And again, in my book, True for You, But Not for Me, I go into the details on that. But it's not as though someone is cut off from salvation simply because he grew up in a certain region where he hasn't heard the gospel. The question is, what has he done with the light that he has received? And so we can go into the details of this, but I think fundamentally the Christian faith is in the same place as the pluralist. The pluralist accuses the Christian or charges the Christian with being geographically limited, which is kind of like pluralism, which is exclusive, which is kind of like pluralism. The pluralist says, no, the Christian faith cannot remain as it is. It has to be watered down. It has to be chiseled away so that something that looks like a very human, non-divine, non-resurrected Jesus, that's the kind that the pluralist can live with. So again, the pluralist charges the Christian with thinking that he has this inside scoop, that he has some sort of insider information that other people don't have. Well, that's what the pluralist is doing. He believes that he has a virtue that the Christian doesn't have. He believes he has access to, in a sense, to the whole elephant. You're familiar with that?
Yes.
The blind men touching the different parts of the elephant, and one person says it's a wall or it's a snake or whatever. And the pluralist says that the Christian claims that he can see everything, rather than being culturally limited and only being able to see one part of it. Well, the pluralist doesn't think that he's just one blind man touching one part of the elephant, and no, he's speaking about the whole elephant, that he can see these things clearly, and that the Christian is the one who only sees part of the picture, or touches part of the picture. And so they're logically in the same position. So the pluralist is not improving upon the situation because he believes that he has this access to the truth. And even so, the pluralist believes that all religions are culturally conditioned attempts to get at this ultimate reality, what we some call God. But is the pluralist himself culturally conditioned? How is the cultural conditioning avoided by the pluralist? as though he can rise above that cultural conditioning and see things clearly, whereas the Christian or the Muslim or the Buddhist is culturally conditioned and can't see those things clearly. So again, those are a few things that I would say in response to the religious pluralists, that there are just a number of problems and inconsistencies, and again, charging the Christian with certain things that I would say the pluralist is guilty of.
And let me go back here. So once again, I'm here with Paul Copan from, is it?
Copan.
Copan, of course. Forgive me, brother. Paul Copan. You are a professor of philosophy in Florida, which is a university?
Palm Beach Atlantic University.
Palm Beach Atlantic University. I can hear the philosopher coming out of you because you're diving into the presuppositions and backdrops and worldviews that people are addressing when they do raise these objections. That's one of the things we need to do, is understand, not just answer a question, but address the question behind the question, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
That. Yeah, you do that brilliantly in your books, by the way, in your talks. So yeah, I admire you a lot for that and learn a lot from that.
Good, thanks.
Regarding the issue of the pluralists, let's move it down the road a little bit. Now, one of the questions that people raise in the pluralist perspective is the question of relativism, which we just talked about. You just did a video series on that, right? Or a short video for PragerU. I look forward to seeing that. We are conditioned to see the world in our sociological perspective, in our mindset, in our worldview, in our even physiologically. That's how we're created. Immanuel Kant talked about the nous. We can't see this. All we can see is what we're programmed. Space-time, we're limited by these axioms. The world around us limits us to what we think is right. Christians of old have harped on the absolute truth of the gospel, or the absolute truth of our ethical situations. But the fact of the matter is, the only one who has objective access to this other realm is the one who has omniscient knowledge. We don't have access to this. And different Christian perspectives, the Orthodox Catholics and others, disagree about what, even issues like abortion or infallibility of the scriptures. For yourself, as a believer, as a man of God, how do you draw the line between becoming completely dogmatic, where you don't even hear the other side, and relativistic, where you just throw your hands up and say whatever it goes? How do you balance that as a philosopher, as a Christian?
Well, going to Immanuel Kant, of course, his own distinction between the noumenal and the phenomenal, that there is a realm that is beyond us that we don't have access to, does raise the question, how do you know that? How do you know that there is that realm beyond? How do you know that there is just that we're simply dealing with appearances rather than having access to reality? The person who says we can't have access to reality presumably has some access to reality in order to be able to know that.
Right.
So I would say that even Kant raises some important questions, and I think does remind us about the importance of humility and so on. But again, it can't be a fully consistent position here. That we can know certain things even if we don't know them exhaustively or with absolute certainty and so forth. But again, going back to the issue of the Christian faith and maybe differences within the Christian tradition, I mean, I think there are some basics that we can agree on. There are some. I know that at the margins, a liberal Christianity, the infallibility of Scripture, or issues like abortion and so forth. I mean, I think there's been a tradition that has rejected abortion, has embraced the infallibility of Scripture, but again, around the margins, say mainline denominations, those sorts of things are being challenged or pushed back on. But I think speaking more generally, when it comes to denominational issues and confidence about certain things, well, I emphasize keeping the main thing the main thing. There are certain creeds, there are certain tenets of the Christian faith that have held regardless of those denominational differences. And I emphasize how that denomination has the sense of, we have the cognate denominator, that there's a common denominator that brings us together, that these are the things that we can agree to. as Christians, that these have been the fundamentals that have defined the Christian faith over the centuries, and that bring us together despite some of those secondary differences. So it's important for us to remember that, as one Lutheran theologian put it, he said, in essentials liberty, in non-essentials unity, in all things. Sorry, let me go back. Let's cut that. Let me do this here. Yeah, in essentials unity, in non-essentials liberty, in all things charity.
All things charity.
That we need to focus on the main things that unite us, and then on those secondary issues that are not as pressing, that are not connected to salvation and so forth, that we, or even Christian living and so forth, that we give liberty, like meat offered to idols and so forth, is an issue. People can have different convictions on those things and whether to eat that. But Paul is emphasizing that we ought to keep the main thing, and accept one another as brother and sister in Christ and so forth. So, and again, as we go about all of these things, to show love to one another.
Okay. And that love is, Jesus said, they shall know you by your love, not your understanding of truth or objective.
There's, Jesus said, that, in John 13:35, that by this all will know that you're my disciples if you love one another.
Right.
But of course, doctrine is certainly critical, but even how we disagree is going to be important. Paul said that the Lord's servant is, must not argue, that we engage in these meaningless controversies and endless disputes and so forth, that there ought to be a principled way of engaging. And Paul, of course, was very strong about the truth that doctrine does matter. But again, how do we disagree about these things? How do we engage with people who think differently than we do?
So moving on halfway here, Matthew 7, Jesus says, "Judge not, least to be judged." Probably one of the favorite verses of some of my liberal colleagues. How do we stand up? Because I see this, Paul, among people who are strongly convicted by what they believe.
Yeah.
It follows logically that anyone who does not follow this path, hypothetically, it must be wrong. Either they're mentally unstable, the lights are not on upstairs, or there's something malevolent about them. Is there? How do you walk that line regarding the judgment of those who are obviously we think are wrong, or think we're wrong?
Right. Yeah. Well, a couple of things here. First, when Jesus is saying this in Matthew 7, don't judge lest you also be judged. A lot of people think that this means not saying anybody is wrong, which is, of course, is not what Jesus is saying. He obviously is saying that there's an issue that needs to be addressed. He says that there is a speck in your brother's eye. No one likes a speck in one's eye. It needs to be taken out. It needs to be removed. Jesus says, first, check yourself. Take the log, the plank out of your own eye, and then you can take the speck out of your brother's eye. In other words, there's the requirement for self-examination, rather than going in with a sense of moral superiority and acting as though you are above and beyond that particular issue, that you are invulnerable to temptation and so forth. First, check yourself. First, understand your own frailty, your own sinfulness, your own weakness, and so on. And then, with that in mind, going to help someone as a fellow sinner, as someone who is in need of God's grace and the forgiveness of others, that we're all part of this together. So you go with that spirit. Paul says something similar in Galatians 6:1. He says, if a brother or sister is overtaken in a fault or a sin, you who are spiritual, you who have the Spirit of God, ought to restore that person in a spirit of gentleness, looking to yourself, lest you also be tempted. So we have, the judging there has to be, in Matthew 7, has to do with having the sense of moral superiority at the failure of someone else. But it's not as though Jesus is, so that's judgmentalism. But it doesn't mean that we're not to be discerning and making right judgments. In fact, in John 7:24, Jesus says, don't judge by mere appearances, but make a right judgment.
Okay.
So there's a call for making a proper assessment rather than a superficial one. But again, we cannot evade making judgments. We will make judgments all the time.
Not making a judgment is a judgment.
Yeah, or saying who are you to judge someone else? You're judging that person for judging someone else.
So we can divide maybe the Lord Jesus' statement as saying when he talked about judging, there's a difference between discerning and condemning, and he's going more for the latter.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's the sense of condemnation. I mean, of course, Jesus does indeed share in. He does offer words of condemnation and judgment against the Pharisees and religious leaders in Matthew 23. But what Jesus is telling us here is that while John 7:24, that judgments are important, that we teach our children to make judgments between good and evil and to go on the pathway of righteousness and so forth. So these are vital for us. But to act as though we are not in need of grace, we're not in need of forgiveness, to act as though we are morally superior because that person has done that and we're better than that, that fails to understand the fact that we are in need of God's grace, that we are in need of forgiveness from God. And so we ought to remember that we go to another person as a fellow sinner, as someone who is also in need of grace. That it's often, as Paul says in Romans chapter 2, he says that it's the kindness of God that leads us to repentance. I think so often we think we can come down hard on someone, that's going to lead that person to repentance. And I think more often than not, it's going to be kindness, it's going to be gentleness, it's going to be going to a person as a fellow sinner rather than as though you're better than that person, you're telling that person how to do things. So I think that kind of a spirit is what Jesus is calling us to.
Being from the Middle East, sometimes I appreciate when my brothers are direct. They go for the jugular right away from me, like when I'm off the bad path. But you develop that relationship, and sometimes it takes wisdom to know the difference.
Sure.
Okay, let's shift the conversation toward science a little bit. Then we'll move into one of the best books I've had engaged in, which is Is God a Moral Monster? So you just published, or recently, some other things are being published on Christianity and science and intermingling between the two. Give us a brief overview of was it Dictionary of Science?
Dictionary of Christianity and Science, Zondervan, yeah.
Yes. I want to give a plug for that book.
Appreciate it.
As a believer, God, I see the world, or as Newton talked about, God created two worlds. You want to
two books,
two books, yes, the book of science. Go ahead and expand on that. I'll let you take that up, and how we can see the world from that perspective.
It's been kind of a long-standing metaphor where God, Francis Bacon, for example, talked about how God has revealed himself not only in his word, but also in his world or in his works. That as we look at the realm of the natural world and study it through science, that we see that God has revealed himself in the natural world. We see order, we see beauty, we see power, we see intelligence, we see creativity, that these are manifestations of the mind, the handiwork of God, and that these are a way of pointing us in the direction of God and his character and so forth. And so that's why Romans 1 talks about, ever since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that people are without excuse. So we do see that there is this, the world, as well as the Word of God, in which we have special revelation. We have God's path of salvation that is presented to us through Jesus Christ. And so, as Galileo said, that when the scriptures and the natural world are properly understood, properly interpreted, that there will fundamentally be no conflict between the two of them. So we find that science is a way in which we can see the workings of God through the processes that he's put in place. So for example, when the psalmist says, you knit me together in my mother's womb, I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Well, it doesn't mean that God directly created the psalmist, but it does mean that God, through wisdom, through intelligence, put together the whole process by which the psalmist could be conceived and born and so forth. That it is indeed a fearful and wonderful thing that you see the handiwork of God through this whole process. So even though it's indirect, even though it uses what philosophers would call secondary causes,
Yes.
That God is the one who is behind these things, that it still reveals the mind, the intelligence, the planning of God.
Let's raise a mild objection. I don't know how mild it is, but David Hume talked about this. The same hand that made the world and designed the DNA molecule. Of course, Hume didn't talk about DNA, but bringing it to modern vernacular. You also see volcanic eruptions. You see cancer. You see threats. You see decay. You see bloodletting. The same world, and those things make you turn and say, "What on earth? This is the hand of a benevolent being." This leads us later on to the problem of evil, but God did make this, and this leads us to the question of evolution, right? Death before the fall, etc. How do you reconcile that with the that God is love, as Jesus talked about in 1 John, which young Earth creationists talk about a lot?
Yeah. Well, again, I don't know what your take is on all these things. I'll just give a few thoughts on how I see these things. Well, first, when it comes to the death before the fall, I do think that there is animal death before the fall. We see in the latter chapters of Job, in Psalm 104, that God is the one who puts a food chain in place, and this is seen as a divine provision. It's God. It says these lions in Psalm 104 seek their prey from from God. That God is the one who provides for them. Yeah. And it says later on in Psalm 104 that God opens His hand for them, for these creatures that seek their food from God. It said, and it is good. So there's the same word that's used in Genesis 1 that is now being used here, and it is, I think, very important for us to keep in mind that the food chain, the predatory animals and so forth, they've been with us. Again, they were on the scene before human beings came on the scene. There was animal death before human beings were around, and so it's not as though all death came through human rebellion, but rather that humans that in their separation from God became vulnerable to death. God had withdrawn His sustaining grace, and so they become vulnerable to their mortality. That God has sustained human beings in life. So we can talk about humans being created even with mortal bodies, but God sustaining them in a sense, preserving them from death while they're in fellowship with Him. And then we'd say that they became vulnerable to those predatory animals, to volcanoes, to hurricanes, to earthquakes and so forth. Things which actually are generally beneficial so long as human beings aren't affected by them. If you didn't have earthquakes that lead to again, this part of tectonic this tectonic plate shifting, continent building, as mountains are built, there's erosion and so forth. There's soil that is created, and without this tectonic plate shifting, and you would have actual. All the soils would run off of the continents, and plant life would be impossible. You can sustain animal life. So, and even the temperature extremes are avoided through tornadoes, through hurricanes that equalize these temperatures and make life livable on the earth. That you don't have extreme temperatures. Within our atmosphere, but these are essentially regulated or modulated through these forces. So there's a general benefit that comes, but when human beings are affected by those, again as a result of the fall, then we become, it's what we call, again, natural evil. But we can also say that even in the midst of natural evils, these are often wake-up calls to remind us that all is not well in the world, that we are, this is not the ultimate world, that we are still in need of reconciliation with God, that often through pain, God, C.S. Lewis said, pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. A lot of times through natural evils, we are awakened to our own vulnerability, to a reminder that things are not the way that they ought to be, that there is something that is terribly wrong. And so, again, God is going to be, there's another world to come in which we have resurrection bodies, in which this first earth that has been created, again, it's a planned obsolescence. It is a world that's been created. Again, it's temporary. It is not ideal. It is not ultimate, but it's going to give way to the ideal world, and that there will be a world in which all sorrow and suffering and tears will be wiped away. And so that is the world to which we look for an immortal body, in which there is harmony between of all creation and so forth, in which we, of course, ultimately are in the unshielded presence of God, that God will dwell in the midst of His people and so forth. That's what we look forward to. But in the meantime, pain can alert us to the fact that all is not well in the world, and that God has not removed all of these reminders from this world to point us to the fact that there is something that is not right, that will ultimately be rectified in the end. So those are some things that kind of, again, you can follow up with some questions, but again, those are some themes that I see as, I think, very relevant as we think about human beings placed in this world, but yet things seem to also go wrong and affect human beings and bring sorrow and heartache and so forth. And how do we work through those things?
Right. Okay, thank you. Again, this is Khaldun Swice. I'm here with Paul Copan. For Logically Faithful, we are engaging culture redemptively and addressing suffering productively. Paul, what are the issues with suffering on a deeper existential level or a theological level? Is one of the questions that's being addressed, and it's answered into this question point of the free will defense. The Reformed perspective rejects that. Part of it says that this is a plan of God the whole time. He never had a plan B. He always had this part of his plan, the suffering of Christ is there in it. Our suffering is part of the whole plan. How do you deal with the question of saying God allows free will, like the Plantinga perspective, in order for us to be loving creatures? Free will is a necessary part of a creation where people can love. However, heaven is a place where people are free, but they don't choose evil or wickedness, at least in the post perspective, not the pre one, where they have the knowledge or the character of Christ. And God is the most free being there is, but He never chooses evil. And Christ being half full man, fully God, now at this stage, there is no one more free, fully man. Evil's not even on the table for Him. So is the question of free will an adequate answer, you think, for the conundrum we face of why, or one of the reasons the divine or God allows this in our world? Things from cancer to the shooting in the schools.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've raised a number of issues and various theological perspectives here. I mean, I do think that there are differing ways of looking at this, and there are people from a different theological perspective who will maintain a kind of a libertarian freedom up to a point. So even the Westminster Confession maintains what seems to be libertarian freedom in the garden.
You're not a libertarian, are you?
I am.
You are.
Yeah.
You are.
Yeah, so that human beings did have a genuine choice in the garden. I mean, God foreknew it and so forth. He knew what was going to happen. But this is something that even John Calvin, I think, supports, that there was genuine freedom within the garden, and that human beings could choose to do otherwise. Like a Reformed theologian like R.C. Sproul would maintain, had maintained that view as well. But I would say that fundamentally the free will is crucial to I think making sense of one human distinctiveness here, that and also distancing God from evil. Someone like R.C. Sproul's son, R.C. Sproul Jr., maintained that God is ultimately responsible. He is the author of evil. Again, that's I think a heretical perspective.
I remember that.
That God created evil, which again I think is a theological confusion. Evil is not a thing, but he is the one who is the culprit, as R.C. Sproul Jr. says. What he's trying to do is say that ultimately God is behind the emergence of sin, that it was not due to Satan, it was not due to anything wrong with Adam and Eve, it wasn't anything about the environment, so therefore God has to be the author of sin, even though he himself is not sinful. So again, this becomes problematic, but I think it does highlight some of the issues that often come up if that sometimes God can be brought so close to being the author of evil that it becomes, again, the scriptures distance themselves from anything like that, that every good and perfect gift comes from God. Don't accuse God of being the one who is the source of, say, even temptation and so forth, James 1 says. So as we look at the freedom of the will, keep in mind too that for God to create moral agents, only God by definition sin is not an option for God. Sin is not a possibility for God. God cannot be overwhelmed by some sort of a force beyond himself. He cannot be led into sin as though something could overpower him. God is necessarily good, but when he makes creatures, they don't have that kind of status. They don't have the status of necessary goodness. So that means it is possible for human beings to diverge from the path that we, by virtue of the use or abuse of free will, can embrace God as the ultimate good, or can turn away from God as the ultimate good and cling to, say in the garden, something that is a lesser good, something that is a non-ultimate good. So it's not as though God created something bad in the world and we gravitated to it. No, God created all things good, but we freely chose to fix our attention, like the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, to fix our attention on that which was created good, but yet not ultimate. And so they diverted their attention from God, the ultimate good, to a lesser good, namely this tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so that became the point of stumbling through the abuse of free will. So again, once you understand that there is a hierarchy of goods, God being the ultimate good, and then lesser goods that God created, then you understand how human beings could have gone wrong, not because there is something defective in the world, but rather because humans shifted their attention freely away from God and focused on a lesser good. And again, that became a God substitute, as it were. And so they focused on something less than ultimate, the prohibitions. They focused on this tree, and we can't even touch it lest we die, of course, which is going beyond what God had said. And so highlighting the fact that this became the focal point, or the point of attention for our first ancestors. So this is I think what is going on here. And so the abuse of free will, I think, helps to explain how evil could enter into this world. Well, what about the afterlife? What about human beings in the afterlife? Well, I think you can look at it in a couple of different ways. One is to say that this world is, in a sense, the staging area in which we set our moral and spiritual compass either toward God or away from him. And so in the end, you get what you want. You get what your heart ultimately desires.
That could be frightening.
Yeah, true, exactly. So a second scenario would look like this: that yes, human beings are created with free will. That's what, if you will, defines them.
Right. You think it's
that
an
this
essential
is
property?
an essential property.
Okay.
Some will argue, and I think there's a good case can be made for that. Well, what if it's the case that free will continues, that it's logically possible that sin could occur in the new heavens and new earth, but God, by virtue of his foreknowledge, knows that no one will ever freely deviate from the good, and so the pristine nature of the new heavens and new earth is maintained, that there is no sullying of it at all, precisely because God knows that there will never be any sort of deviation from the good in this new scenario.
Okay. This leads us now to another topic. So your book, we just talked about it earlier, Is God a Moral Monster? You're going to release the new anniversary edition, 10th anniversary edition almost?
Yeah, we're working on it.
Working on it,
yeah,
okay.
So,
The thesis of that book is addressing one of the major contentious questions that's written up by the new atheists regarding the God's slaughter of different whole groups of peoples. Some call it genocide. Others have different names for it. The questions of slavery in the scriptures, the brutality of those who claim or follow another God to be taken from the city gates and stoned to death. Even children too who rebel against their parents. Slavery, we have genocide questions. So in your book you address these, which I highly recommend, by the way. What are some of the sticking points you find for people as they're reading scriptures that they don't realize that they're bringing these other perspectives in as they're reading it? What are some ways we can navigate this as we come to difficult passages in scripture, such as these?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that when it comes to, say, the Canaanites, we see that there is I think, a misunderstanding of what is actually going on by many of the critics, like the new atheists. And what you see here is a kind of last resort kind of mindset, that this is something that's been going on for hundreds of years, and God waits until the time is right for the Canaanites to be, for this issue to finally be addressed. And you look at the Canaanites and the kinds of practices that they're engaged in. And there's a misunderstanding. People think, oh, the Canaanites are there minding their own business, and look, these Israelites come in. Well, no, the Canaanites were engaged in practices that would be considered, would be considered criminal in any civilized society. You have ritual prostitution. You have, you have incest. You have bestiality.
Child
have child sacrifice. You have these sorts of things going on. Well, again, this is not as though those Canaanites, they just got tattoos and the Israelites don't, and therefore they need to be driven out. Or so again, even some of those types of things need to be understood, that this is part of the picture. Also, when you look at Israel's mission to be a light to the world, you need to consider the fact that there is a group of people, given their theology, their gods are doing these sorts of things, and the very practices that they're carrying out, that these are pernicious influences that could actually jeopardize the mission of Israel to be a light to the nations, of course, ultimately through the Messiah. That this could actually be short-circuited, and that there are grave danger signs, and God is pointing to the people of Israel, saying, you may not know the full ramifications of it, but this is serious business. Don't go that way. It's like a cosmic battle is taking place. It's not as though it's just one nation invading another. No, it's actually that there is something very serious going on here that is could jeopardize the blessing that the Messiah is going to bring to the entire world if Israel capitulates. Now, it did capitulate in a number of different ways, but not sufficiently so that the mission could not be carried through. So I think that's one example. Another example might be, well, when you look at slavery in the Bible, well, I mean, do you even understand what the term is? Because a lot of people associate that with antebellum slavery in the South, as opposed to indentured servitude, which is taking place. That the sorts of practices in the antebellum South and the harm that came to slaves and so forth, again, it is so utterly unlike the sort of regulations and guidelines that the law of Moses gives when it comes to servants. Again, the term servant is a better rendering, but it could even mean worker, someone who is a hired worker for someone. So again, that term slavery, however, throws a lot of people off, and so they read all sorts of negative baggage and emotion into that term. When, for example, the person who's, if his master or employer strikes him so that he dies, well, that employer would be put to death. So there's a capital offense if you do that to your servant. So again, far different from antebellum slavery. If you knock out his eye or tooth, then you'd have to let him go. You couldn't hold him under contract. So again, there are those sorts of provisions for those who are in servitude. But yet we read through modern lenses. We kind of superimpose our own modern understanding of slavery and think, oh, look at how terrible it is. Actually, when you look at it, it's actually a very humanized institution. It is something that, of course, it's far superior to what you see going on in other parts of the ancient Near East. So the Israelite law is actually an improvement. So look at, compare the Israelites to what's going on in other parts of the Middle East or the ancient Near East. You see that the differences are often really quite great, quite remarkable, and we ought to look into those sorts of things. So again, we might, I can go into talk about a number of other issues as well.
I mean, you just said something that will fire off some of my listeners. You said slavery was a humanized institution given the perspective in the ancient Near East. Was slavery a necessary institution that needed to be there, and the Israelite culture under divine mandate regulated it, or what's happening here? Why didn't God just say, as my colleagues would ask me, knock this whole institution off the floor? This is unacceptable given divine mandate of treating people in the Imago Dei.
Yeah, well, I'd say they are being treated in the image of God. That's the problem. A lot of moderns think they're not when they read the term slavery. And unfortunately, a lot of Bible translations use that term very freely, whereas in the King James Version, 1611, the term slave in the Old Testament is used only once. Here you have all that's happened: colonialism, slavery, Jim Crow laws, and so forth. You have all of this negative baggage, and then the term slavery is used, multiple times. Or just under a couple hundred times. But you see that in modern translations you see, well, why use that loaded term when, say, maybe someone like servant or even worker would suffice? Don't use this loaded terminology that will throw off a lot of modern readers. Okay. So again, there's a faulty inference that's made already. But secondly, when you look at the kind of, who is the person who is, put into servitude? Well, it's a person who is poor and has it's a last resort sort of thing. So you basically contract yourself, sell yourself to someone who can care for you, give you food, clothing, shelter, and work. It's actually not a bad arrangement. Those who are servants in a household actually become part of the family. This is something that gives security to people and so forth. And some people found this arrangement so pleasing that they would actually commit themselves to a lifetime of this, rather than just having a short term of this, up to 7 years. So basically, this servitude becomes a kind of safety net for people who, when they're impoverished, they have no other alternative. It's like the Social Security system. And typically you would contract yourself out to someone who is a relative who within your own tribal clan territory. And so there is a certain familiarity and so forth. So it's not as though you're being deported. Also, you become a servant because you contract yourself for this. It's not as though you've been kidnapped. Kidnapping was a capital offense. That's how modern slave trade got going. So again, a lot of modern inferences, you got a lot of modern assumptions are being imported into the biblical text that the biblical text would repudiate. Okay. And so I think that there are a lot of misunderstandings about this. Now, there's one text that some people will bring up, Leviticus 25, where you can take people who are foreigners you may take them and they could be your servants perpetually. Well, what is that? What is that all about? Well, how do you acquire people as servants? Well, often through their war. After a war, there are people who are left alive, and so what do you do with them? They have no alternative, and so to attach themselves to Israelite homes might be the best alternative. It's actually a very humane alternative compared to, well, they'd just be put to death by other armies, but not so with the Israelites in kind of general warfare. You also have certain. It says that the person who you can take these people who are servants, from foreigners, and they can be your servants. And again, that can come through a number of different ways, but it's not through kidnapping. And then it goes on to say that the person who is the alien or sojourner among you, again, you could have these aliens and sojourners to work for you. But if that person becomes a person of means, then he could actually hire an Israelite to work for him. So is that, and he can. The term that they use, acquire, the same word that's used of acquiring these foreigners, he may acquire an Israelite. Does that mean the Israelite is just property? No, of course not. He may purchase him. That word is used of God's redeeming or purchasing or Israel as they came out of Egypt through the Red Sea. That Exodus 15 uses that same term of the people of Israel. So does that mean that they're property and so forth?
No.
No, not at all.
Okay. But
I think a lot of people who are critical when it comes to, say, Leviticus 15, they haven't read far enough to verse 47, where it talks about how this foreigner, this sojourner, could actually become a person of means. So he's not required to maintain a lifetime of service within Israel. In fact, he can even rise in station, become a person of means, and even hire. If if there's no one to redeem the Israelite, but he can even hire an Israelite. He could acquire him, but it doesn't mean that the Israelite is just property.
let's start landing this plane. Let's draw this into a literary perspective. You've been challenged on this in a recent conference you did last year with Defenders Media with Veracity Hill here in Chicago on this question by some of our liberal colleagues, and even some people take a slightly different perspective than you do on it. Walk with me here. You have the command given to Saul and his armies. It's very similar command given to Joshua and his armies. You're one of the soldiers. You go into this village. You're soldiers out there. You're ready. You're armed for combat. You have the sword in your hand. You walk into a home. You see a family. God says, commanded, kill every living thing. Do not leave anything alive, including children. You're thinking this is what Herod commanded 2,000 plus years later. Hold on a minute. Oh, not 2,000, probably 1,005. The soldier drops his sword and says, I cannot do this, as he looks into the eyes of a little child and walks away. He's being disobedient to the command given to him by Yahweh, by God. But is he doing the right thing? Bring some perspective on this.
Yeah. Well, my book, Did God Really Command Genocide? Matt Flanagan and I, we go into a lot of this. New Zealand, Kiwi. But we look at this again. Keep in mind in 1 Samuel 15, the Amalekites were told that Saul had already utterly destroyed the Amalekites. At the end of the book, David is fighting, and he is fighting against an army of the Amalekites. Well, did Saul already do that? Well, the narrator tells us that he did, that Saul utterly destroyed them. And it's interesting that as you look at the very battle that is being highlighted, he's going to a pitched battle with the Amalekites. You have another group of people, the Kenites, who are there, and Saul says to them, we don't have an issue with you. And so they end up leaving. So do you think that there are going to be women and children hanging around in this citadel where there's this pitched battle that they're preparing for? No. Also keep in mind in chapter 14, verse 48 of 1 Samuel, just prior to this, you have the Amalekites who've just raided the Israelites. So you have again, they've been a thorn in the side of the Israelites from the very beginning, from the time that the Israelites crossed over the Red Sea and they were attacked, blindsided by the Amalekites in Exodus 17. So you have mentioned that there's utter destruction. Again, there's even question. How do we even interpret utter destruction? Well, I mean, there is hyperbole, but also in John and Harvey Walton in their book on the lost world of the Israelite conquest, they argue that the term utterly destroy is not a proper rendering of this term. It has to do with identity removal, and one key person whose identity, who was kind of a rallying point for the Amalekites, was the king, whom Saul kept alive. So he had violated that, King Agag, and so Samuel thrust him through. But again, a lot of times you see that, for example, in Leviticus 27, you see mention of a servant or an animal or a field that is, again, harem. What does that mean? Utterly destroyed? No, it means removed from ordinary use, so that the person he's going to serve in the tabernacle, or the field is going to be given to the priests. But it's not as though the field is burned, or destroyed somehow. You can have, in fact, there are only 3 cities that were destroyed in the book of Joshua: Jericho, Ai, and Hazor. But all the rest remained intact, and basically what the Israelites were to do was to drive out the inhabitants, and again, these were largely military citadels, fortresses, to drive them out, and then they went back to their base camp in Gilgal. But if somebody went back into that city, man, woman, child, they would leave themselves open to destruction. So the first command was to drive them out, and if anybody remains behind, if anybody's foolish enough to go back in, then their lives would be forfeit. They would leave themselves open to being harmed. So the first command is to drive them out. The second command is, if anybody's still sticking around, then they're in these cities that are set aside from ordinary use, then they could be put to death. So there's more going on here than meets the eye. God tells, God said He is going to utterly destroy, before the Babylonian captivity, all the cities of Judah, and they're going to be in everlasting desolation. Well, Judah's still around after the Babylonian captivity. The cities are only going to be abandoned for 70 years. So again, there's very strong hyperbolic sweeping language that's often going along with this. So that's another component of all of this too.
So that question I asked you earlier, there still stands. It goes down to the Abrahamic sacrifice of Isaac as well. If a divine command is given to do this act, which we see as a sword and critic art called existentially problematic, or you suspend the transcendent in order for you to accept the ethical, or the other way around, would you be ethical to walk away from this kind of perspective? Is it a test from God to see whether you even do it? It becomes really convoluted ethically.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if God, again, what we have mentioned earlier on is that this is exceptional warfare. This is warfare that is, again, highly regulated. It is limited geographically. It is limited to a certain people. It is also something that is also in place, assuming that the part 1, to drive them out, is in place. And so again, if they're still sticking around, then they leave themselves vulnerable to harm. But keep in mind that these things would be wrong if an all-good, all-wise God were not commanding these sorts of things. There may be certain provisional things that are commanded that are out of the ordinary, that are not normally done, but that may be for a particular morally justifiable reason, that they are to be carried out. So, for example, a lot of people think, it's always immoral to take innocent human life. Well, there may be some exceptions to that. There may be moral justification. For example, when a woman is has an ectopic pregnancy, the fertilized egg is in the fallopian tube rather than implanted in the uterus. Well, in order to salvage at least the mother's life, then the life of the unborn is, again, it's not saying we're celebrating this, or it's a tragic thing, but it, again, is something that's morally justifiable in order to save that other life. So taking innocent human life would be morally justifiable. Or when a plane has been hijacked, it's going to be used to as a weapon of mass destruction to kill thousands. Well, if a president or prime minister says to shoot the plane out of the sky, well, I'd say it's morally justifiable, even though it means that those on board, innocent men, women, and children, that they would perish
That was
as a result of
by the
that.
Bush administration. I remember 9/11.
It was, yeah. So in this sort of a scenario, there would be some occasions on which, again, it's not a universal norm, it's the exception to the rule. That there are some duties that may be overridden in cases of supreme emergency.
Okay.
And so this would be one of those cases. What about Abraham and Isaac? Well, one, God had already promised Abraham that his son Isaac would be the father of, and bring blessing to many nations. So he already knew that there would be, that ultimately harm would not come to him in some sort of ultimate way, because he says, "We will go and worship, and we will return." He tells his servants,
God will provide.
God, and God, of course, he said God will provide, and so you also have a lot that's going on behind the scenes that we don't know. Like, for example, Isaac is presumably old enough to even overpower his father, because he's supposed to carry the wood. But yet there must be some sort of an understanding that this is what God has promised, this is what God has commanded, but God is going to work it out. And so you have Isaac, who is part of this, he's cooperating with this process. So you'd say, yeah, there are some things ordinarily this would not be commanded. In fact, God, Abraham doesn't yet know that that infant or child sacrifice is something that would be prohibited by God. In fact, it's a lesson that God is saying, no, I'm not going to go this way. I'm not going to do this. But Abraham doesn't know. He's living in a culture where this is happening, and so he doesn't know what the true God would require of him. But he goes along with this, and then finds out that no, God isn't going to go this pathway. So again, but he does know that God is going to do something that is, that he's going to come back with his son alive. So he has been reassured of that. So again, yes, there are certain divine commands that are given that may seem out of the ordinary, that may seem like, how could God command this? But God has morally sufficient reasons for commanding this. There are some things that God says he would not command, that did not even enter his mind. He mentions in the book of Jeremiah. So there are some. It's not as though God can just flip it, and say, this is good, this is bad, but then he flips them and says the opposite. No, it's not as though good and bad change places here. God could not command something that is intrinsically evil. But if God commands something that is difficult, he will have morally sufficient reasons for doing so.
Final question. This leads us to this analogy with Abraham and Isaac. Many of my brothers and sisters and others who are of different faiths or different perspectives listening to this now and watching this feel like Isaac walking up the mountain with God, and they have the wood on their back. What are you doing, God? There's chaos around them. The ground is shaking under them. The body's decaying inside them. There's betrayals, pain, suffering in people. One of the major motifs of Logically Faithful in my ministry is to help to equip people to deal with that.
Yeah.
Give some final words to people who are in the storm.
Yeah.
With your background in apologetics, how does that become an anchor for them, or how do they deal with it, and how did you deal with it?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think even just borrowing from the Abraham-Isaac motif, Abraham does say that God will provide. And we do see that in Jesus Christ, God does provide, and the language that's used in, say, Romans chapter 8 is borrowing from Genesis 22, where you did not withhold your one and only Son. We read in Romans chapter 8 that God did not withhold his son, but freely gave him up for us all. And so here we have a picture of God. Even though he stopped short with Isaac, he went the full way with his own son, that his son willingly laid down his life for us, that we might be reconciled to God, that God is not shrinking from doing the sorts of things that he's commanding Abraham to do, that God fully enters into this. God gives of himself freely so that we might be reconciled to God. And I think it does raise certain questions about the problem of evil when we look at the chaos, the terrible things that happen in the world. All of us will have to make a choice. We'll have to say, am I going to privilege my limited experience with evil, the things that I can see? Is that going to be the privileged starting point by which I make judgments about God and so forth? Or will I take a stand on the fact that there is a God who enters into this world, who gives himself freely for his enemies, that God in this sacrifice is guaranteeing that in the end everything is going to be made right, that this is the guarantee that God has not forgotten about us, and that God is going to set everything right in the end, that the Hitlers and Stalins of this world will not get away with murder, that cosmic justice will be done, that there will be a time when all tears are wiped away, and that God's people will be with him forever, that all pain and sorrow will be gone. Will I take a stand on that instead? So again, there's a choice here. Which will I privilege? Am I going to privilege this kind of the cosmic picture where cosmic justice is done, where sorrow and tears are removed? Or am I going to take the view that, oh, there can't be a loving God because look at all the evil in the world, and basically I'm left without any sort of resolution to the problem of evil. Cosmic justice will not be done, that there will not be a time when all tears are wiped away, that there will not be any, that God has not acted in this world in order to bring about redemption, to bring about a resolution of the problem of evil. I'm basically saying, no, I'm going to reject all of those things, and I'm going to side with my own perspective on evil. And fundamentally, everybody has to deal with the problem of evil. Everyone has to address the question, does my worldview do a better job of dealing with the problem of evil than the alternatives? And I'd say the Christian faith does the best job of dealing with with this wide sweep of issues. When you look at a world without God, a world that is devoid of God, and well, what resources does that bring to addressing the problem of evil? I'd say you're taking a stand on the wrong thing. Take a stand on with God, who has chosen to act in this world, who suffers with us as we go through this vale of tears, but who is guaranteed that everything is going to be set right in the end. He guarantees that virtue and happiness will ultimately converge for those who have put their trust in God. So that there will not be those Mother Teresas who lived self-sacrificially and so forth, but only to have the same kind of end as Hitler and Stalin, who've gotten away with murder.
You recently did a seminar with the ELF where you said when life gets difficult, when all hell breaks loose, if I may, the tendency is to turn away from God, but in heaven's name, to what?
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow. Paul, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for making the time.
It's been a treat. Thank you. I appreciate it, Kelty.